Hello, my name is Steve. Welcome to American Steam Legacy. Part 6 of our series on the Whyte notation, we'll be taking a look at the 8-coupled articulated steam locomotives. But first of all, I'd like to thank all of you who have subscribed and who have been leaving comments. And for those of you who have not subscribed, I certainly invite you to do so. Your support would be greatly appreciated. And of course, I'm always open for suggestions for future comments. So if there's a wheel configuration or a particular locomotive you'd like covered in a future video, leave a suggestion in the comments section below. So without further delay, let's take a look at the more noteworthy 8-coupled articulated locomotives of the Whyte notation on American Steam Legacy. After the impressive performance of Old Maud, a 6-coupled compound on the Baltimore and Ohio, it wasn't long before other railroads began to take notice. In 1907, the Erie Railroad received 3 locomotives with a 0880 wheel arrangement from Alco. But the wheel configuration wasn't the only thing unique about these engines. The Erie L1 class, as they would be known, were camelback Malays with the cab straddling the midsection of the boiler. The L1s would end up being the only camelback Malays ever built with this wheel configuration. Other than their appearance, everything else about them was typical for the time period. The high-pressure cylinders on the rear engine featured piston valves, while the low-pressure cylinders up front were equipped with slide valves. Both valve sets were actuated by Walschaerts valve gear. The L1s have been described as requiring a strong and skilled fireman for the locomotive to develop its maximum horsepower, suggesting the L1s lacked mechanical stokers. Another attribute, at least according to one observer, was the L1's high water consumption. Angus Sinclair, a railroad operations writer, declared the L1's thirst would dry up the nation's canals and make all waterborne transportation obsolete. Hence, the 0880 would be referred to as the Angus on the Erie Railroad. The L1s would serve the Erie in this configuration until Baldwin rebuilt them into 2 882s in 1921. At first glance, the 2880 would seem like a rather obscure wheel arrangement, and we would assume they were built in rather small numbers. However, the 2880 would account for almost 10% of the articulated power produced in the U.S., with 222 being built. The Union Pacific and Baltimore and Ohio would maintain the largest fleets, with 75 for the UP and 86 for the Baltimore and Ohio. While the Union Pacific and Baltimore and Ohio may have maintained the largest fleets of 2880s, they are not responsible for the type being referred to as consolidation Malays. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe originated the type by taking 2 280 consolidations and rebuilding them into 2 880s in 1911. Since the 280 consolidation was the basis for the 2880, the 2880 became known as a consolidation Malay. Baltimore and Ohio 2880 compounds would undergo an interesting evolution during their service time between their arrival in 1916 and their retirement in the 1950s. Between 1916 and 1919, the Baltimore and Ohio acquired 86 2880s. 15 were built by Alco and 69 by Baldwin. The first 30 arriving in 1916 included the 15 constructed by Alco. These were large locomotives for the time and were intended for the 2.4% grades of the Cumberland Division. With 56-inch drive wheels and a boiler pressure of 210 pounds per square inch, they produced 95,000 pounds of tractive effort. The rear high-pressure cylinders were controlled by Baker valve gear, actuating a piston valve, while the larger front cylinders featured Walschaerts valve gear controlling a slide valve. Apparently, the Baltimore and Ohio was pleased with the performance of the 2880, so much so that in 1919, the road began fitting 8 of its LL1 class 0880s with a pilot truck, making them suitable for service as road engines. In 1927, the Baltimore and Ohio rebuilt 64 of its 2880s into simple articulateds. Boiler pressure and driver diameter remained unchanged. However, the low-pressure cylinder diameter was reduced from 26 to 24 inches. The former low-pressure cylinders on the front engine were not only reduced to 24 inches in diameter, but were also converted to use a piston valve actuated by Baker valve gear, making it identical to the rear engine. In 1922, the Baltimore and Ohio acquired 16 2882 compounds from the Seaboard Airline. These units also underwent a conversion to simple steam distribution, receiving 25-inch diameter cylinders front and rear, but losing the trailing truck. With 63-inch drive wheels and a boiler pressure of 225 pounds per square inch, these 16 locomotives would produce the highest tractive effort of the entire fleet at 121,500 pounds. The Baltimore and Ohio's 2880s would suffer the same fate as most steam locomotives and would be taken out of service in the late 1950s. The 2882 wheel arrangement has gone by several names. The Southern Pacific referred to the type as Mikado Consolidations, while the Chesapeake and Ohio called them Chesapeakes. Few railroads embraced this naming convention and simply referred to the type by its wheel configuration, the 2882. The first examples of the 2882 wheel arrangement appeared on the Southern Pacific in 1909. 29 Baldwin-built compounds were received that year, and by 1928 the number would grow to a total of 49, comprising the MC1 through MC6 classes. These early 2882s were of conventional layout with the cab to the rear of the boiler. In 1928, 48 of the MC class compounds were rebuilt into simple articulated cab forwards. Boiler pressure was increased from 200 to 210 psi, while cylinder diameter was increased from 24 inches on the high-pressure cylinders to 22 inches on both front and rear engines. These changes brought the tractive effort up to 90,000 pounds from 85,000 pounds as built. The addition of a booster engine provided an additional 15,000 pounds of tractive effort. These conversions would comprise the beginnings of the Southern Pacific's famous AC classes of articulated cab forwards. While the Southern Pacific was making history with its 2882s and later 4882 cab forwards, the Norfolk and Western was creating a dynasty with their 2882s. Of nearly 700 2882s built in the U.S., the Norfolk and Western owned 217 of them between 1910 and 1952. The N&W's 30 Y6B class 8-coupled compounds were the culmination of nearly 30 years of continuous improvement. Built between 1948 and 1952 in the Norfolk and Western's Roanoke shops, they featured cast steel engine frames with integrally cast cylinders, a feature that first appeared in the Y5 class. Timken roller bearings were used on all axles, side and main rods, while McGill multi-roll bearings were used on the Baker valve gear. The Y6Bs were also able to operate in simple mode, where high-pressure steam was sent to the front cylinders. This proved problematic since the front engine was very slippery when operating in simple mode. In an attempt to rectify the problem, 26 tons of lead were poured into the front engine's frame, but only increased the front engine's adhesion factor to a still inadequate 3.6. When operating as a true compound with 13,500 tons in tow, the Y6B developed 5,600 horsepower at 25 miles per hour and could reach a top speed of 50 miles per hour thanks to its 58-inch drive wheels. Tractive effort came in at 152,000 pounds and an adhesion factor of 4.4. With these performance numbers, the Y6B was a perfect match for the tonnage the Norfolk and Western needed to move, as well as the grades and curves on the Norfolk and Western system. Some railroad historians consider the Y6B the best compound articulated ever built. There are no surviving members of the Y6B class, however, there is an Alco-built Y3A preserved at the Illinois Railway Museum in Union, Illinois, and a Y6A built by the Norfolk and Western at the Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri. While the terms Southern Pacific and cab forward seem almost synonymous, not all Southern Pacific articulateds were oil-burning cab forwards. The AC9 class was comprised of 12 Lima-built 2884 Yellowstones built in 1939. The Southern Pacific was, however, the only American railroad to operate an 8-coupled cab forward with a 4882 wheel arrangement. The Southern Pacific also rostered cab forwards with 2882 and 4662 wheel configurations. The Southern Pacific's 8-coupled cab forwards were born out of necessity, the necessity of preserving human life and preserving railroad infrastructure. As rail traffic increased over the Sacramento division of the Southern Pacific, more powerful locomotives were needed to deal with the line's 2.4% grades. In 1908, the Southern Pacific ordered 2 conventional 2882 compounds and put them to work on the Sacramento division. 2 problems immediately came to light. First, the division had over 30 miles of snow sheds. The huge volume of exhaust produced by such a large locomotive in a confined space would almost asphyxiate the crew, and second, the force of the exhaust would blow the boards off the snowshed roofs. The solution to the second problem was simple enough. Stack splitters were installed to lessen the impact of the exhaust on snowshed roofs. However, this did nothing to address engine crew safety and comfort. A Southern Pacific engineer may have inadvertently provided a solution to the problem when he insisted his locomotive be coupled to a train by its pilot coupler. With the locomotive running in reversed, the exhaust couldn't enter the cab while running through the snow sheds. But this arrangement put the engineer on the wrong side of the track, which made observing indications on signals difficult. While the Southern Pacific would operate cab-forward articulateds of various wheel configurations beginning in 1910, the 4882 simple articulated variant wouldn't arrive until 1928. That year, the Southern Pacific took delivery of 90 4882 cab-forwards from Baldwin that comprised the AC-10 through AC-12 classes. These would end up being the heaviest cab forwards, weighing in at over 1 million pounds. Tractive effort for the classes of 1928 were 123,400 pounds. In 1942, the Southern Pacific would own 192 2882 cab forwards, all constructed by Baldwin. Even though the cab forwards would comprise 8 classes, their boiler pressures were either 235 or 250 psi, and tractive effort was 115,900 pounds on the low end or 123,400 pounds on the high end. Engine weight and axle loading varied considerably, but cylinder bore and stroke was constant at 24 and 32 inches respectively. Like so many other steam locomotives, the 1950s saw their careers come to a close. The only complete Southern Pacific cab forward to be preserved is number 4294 on static display at the California State Railroad Museum. The 2884 originated with the Northern Pacific Railroad in 1928. That year, the road received a total of 12 locomotives, 1 from Alco and 11 from Baldwin. The Northern Pacific is also responsible for the 2884 becoming known as the Yellowstone, borrowing its name from Yellowstone National Park, which lay in a region served by the Northern Pacific. In all, 72 Yellowstone types were built between 1928 and 1944, with the Baltimore and Ohio owning the largest fleet of 2884s at 30. The Duluth, Mesabi, and Iron Range owned the next largest fleet of Yellowstones, 18 in total, built by Baldwin in 1944. The DM and IR machines could develop 140,000 pounds of tractive effort compared to the Baltimore and Ohio variant producing only 115,000 pounds. Boiler pressure was 240 psi and 335 psi for the DM and IR and the Baltimore and Ohio locomotives respectively. However, there was a significant difference in cylinder diameter. The DM and IR Yellowstones had 24-inch cylinders while the Baltimore and Ohio's were 22 inches. The DM and IR Yellowstones were used as road power, moving loaded ore trains down to the ore docks on Lake Superior in Duluth and Two Harbors, Minnesota. These movements didn't require the enormous pulling power of the 2884 since the trip was downhill. However, the return trip with the empties to Proctor Yard required climbing a 2.2% grade, which the Yellowstones were sometimes asked to do. The Yellowstones shared the runs of empties with other quote-unquote hill locomotives such as 210-4s and 010-2s. One former DM and IR employee claimed the run of empty ore cars from the ore docks up to Proctor was so strenuous for the Yellowstone that it was possible for the locomotive to consume all 25,000 gallons of water and 26 tons of coal from the tender. This may have been a bit of an overstatement, but it does speak to how grueling the climb was, even with a string of empties in tow. 3 DM and IR Yellowstones still survive on static display, all in the state of Minnesota. Number 225 resides in Proctor. Number 227 is on display at the Lake Superior Railroad Museum in Duluth, and number 229 is at the DM and IR Depot in Two Harbors. The 4884 wheel arrangement is unique to the Union Pacific Railroad, since no other railroad or nation built anything like it. The UP developed the 4884 for the grades of the Wasatch Mountains east of Ogden, Utah, hauling 3,600-ton trains unassisted. The UP intended on naming the 4884 the Wasatch, but Alco, the builder of what would become the largest steam locomotive ever built, did them one better. As the first order of 20 locomotives were being readied for their delivery run from Schenectady, New York to North Platte, Nebraska, an Alco employee climbed to the pilot deck with a piece of chalk and wrote Big Boy across the boiler front. When the Union Pacific people saw Big Boy written on one of their new locomotives, they agreed the name was certainly appropriate, and the 4884 wheel arrangement has been known as the Big Boy ever since. When the Union Pacific's Department of Research and Mechanical Standards was tasked with designing a locomotive that could handle the Wasatch grades unassisted with 3,600 tons in tow, they knew a tractive effort of at least 135,000 pounds would be needed and an adhesion factor of at least 4. All of this required a total of 540,000 pounds carried by the drive wheels. It became obvious that an 8-coupled articulated would be required. The Union Pacific never intended the Big Boy to run at 80 miles per hour, but designed them for that speed so there would be some reserve capacity if it was needed. The presence of a 4-wheel pilot truck suggests a locomotive that was intended for high-speed running. A 4-wheel trailer truck became necessary to carry the large firebox required by such a locomotive. Steam from a boiler operating at 300 psi was fed to 4 cylinders 23 3/4 inches in diameter, which in turn drove drive wheels 68 inches in diameter. The general rule of thumb is a locomotive should be able to do 1 mile per hour per inch of driver diameter, which means the big boy could and did achieve speeds of 70 miles per hour. One curious feature of the big boy is the lack of a feed-water heater. Since 1915, the Interstate Commerce Commission required all U.S.-built steam locomotives to have at least two methods of getting water into the boiler. The live steam injector was the primary method, and the feed-water heater's hot water pump was the other. The big boys are equipped with exhaust steam injectors instead of feed-water heaters. The generally accepted reason is the engineers at Alco couldn't find space for the hot water pump and its associated piping. This seems a dubious claim since locomotives like the Chesapeake and Ohio Allegheny and the Norfolk and Western Class A, which are much more compact designs, are able to accommodate a feed-water heater and its associated plumbing. Feed-water heater notwithstanding, the big boy has captured hearts and minds like no other. It is arguably the biggest and heaviest steam locomotive ever built. Of the 25 big boys built by Alco between 1941 and 1944, 8 still exist. In 2014, number 4014 was completely restored and converted to run on oil. Since 2019, number 4014 has been under steam and heading excursion trains across the western United States. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. And once again, my name's Steve, and thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.